بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد هذا ما رواه الإمام أبو جعفر الطحاوي في ذكر بيان اعتقاد أهل السنة والجماعة على مذهب فقهاء الملة أبي حنيفة النعمان بن ثابت الكوفي وأبي يوسف يعقوب بن إبراهيم الأنصاري وأبي عبد الله محمد بن الحسن الشيباني رضوان الله تعالى عليهم أجمعين وما يعتقدون من أصول الدين ويدينون به لرب العالمين. This is Aqidah al-Tahawiyyah narrated by Imaam Abu Jafar Tahawi rahmatullah alayh, and it is into the explanation of creed and fundamental belief and aqidahs of Ahlus Sunnati wal Jama'ah. And it will be according to the school of thought of fuqaha of this ummat, Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayh and Abu Yusuf and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani Ridwanullahi ta'ala ajma'in. Whatever they used to believe from the fundamentals of deen, that is what will be mentioned. And by these fundamental beliefs, we will gain nearness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he says, قال الإمام وبه قال الإمامان المذكوران رحمهم الله تعالى. So Imam Abu Jafar Tahawi and those Imams who are mentioned in above, they all are collectively saying together that نقول في توحيد الله تعالى معتقدين بتوفيق الله تعالى. We believe, we declare, we say about the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we have firm faith and belief by the tawfiq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what is the tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Inna Allah ta'ala wahidun la sharika lah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one, and no one is partner to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, when it comes to us, we are also one. But there are so many people like us. There is nobody like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is nobody like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala into his personalities, into his personality, and no one like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala into his attributes and into his qualities. I see and you see, but the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala see, no one can see like that. So inna Allah ta'ala wahidun la sharika lah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one, and there is no partner of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wala shay'a mithlah. And nothing is similar to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wala shay'a mithla. Nothing is similar to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As I was saying just now, that we have so many similar personalities like us. But when it comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, no one is similar to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wala shay'a yu'jizuhu. And nothing can compel Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nothing can make Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ajiz. Nothing can make Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is forced to do that. Nothing can do that. Wala ilaha ghayruhu. And there is no deity of worship beside Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Qadimun bila ibtida. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is such eternal that there is no beginning of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is no beginning of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Daimun bila intiha. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is such eternal that there is no end of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everybody else, all creatures, all creations, they had their beginning and they will have their end. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has no beginning and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has no end. La yafni wa la yubid, wa la yabid. La yafni wa la yabid. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not perish. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not face any end, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will remain forever. Wa la yakunu illa ma yurid. Nothing happens except whatever Allah plans. Whatever Allah plans, that is what will happen, and that is what is happening. لا تبلغه الأوهام ولا تدركه الأفهام. Understand the sentence. لا تدركه الأوهام ولا تدركه الأفهام. Our imagination cannot grasp the reality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whatever you think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah is always beyond that. Whatever you imagine, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always beyond that. Your reach of imagination can never ever go to the reality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And your understanding, you have vision. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us wisdom and vision and understanding and intellect. Our intellect cannot discover the reality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When it comes to the realities of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, no intellect can discover the reality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and no imagination, no thought, no reflection can reach the reality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَا تُشْبِهُهُ الْأَنَامِ. When it comes to creatures, no creature has any similarity with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No creature has no similarity with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Hayyun la yamut. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ever living. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never ever die. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is hayyun, ever living, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never die. Qayyumun la yanam. He is the controller. He looks after. He is the protector. He oversees in such a manner, la yanam, that not for a split second he sleeps. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we cannot even imagine. These words are explanation about our belief into the qualities of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, into the personality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, into the sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us such that we start our journey. We start our journey into the tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as far as His attributes are concerned and as far as His personality is concerned. Our ibadat, our lifelong journey through Quran and Sunnah, through the teaching of Quran and Sunnah, that is the name of a journey, that you keep drowning into the tawheed of every sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, every attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you are progressing. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it such that when we die with utter tawheed, with the reality of tawheed. No one will have greater tawheed than Muhammadur Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Oh Allah, give us some iota from the tawheed of Muhammadur Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as far as, oh Allah, your personality is concerned, what he believed, what he said, what he taught. And when it comes to your sifat, your attributes, your qualities, whatever he believed and whatever he preached, whatever he promoted, whatever he taught, oh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, give us good grasp of the tawheed of your sifat. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make that possible. So, Qayyumun la yanam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, Qayyum, who controls everything, in whose protection everything, under his order everything functions. La yanam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never sleeps. Khaliqun bila haja. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates his creations and he is not in need of his creation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates his creations and he is not in need of his creation. Raziqun lahum bila mu'na. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sustains them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala nourished them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala nurtured them with no difficulty. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala nurtured them with no difficulty. We don't even know, as we always say, that the world of science, they had discovered so far only 4% from the universe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And for that also they are into the bewilderment, into the amazement. The undiscovered universe is much greater than that. And what lies in that undiscovered universe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala controls everything. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala nurture every creature. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala nourish every creature. And without any difficulty. Mumitun bila makhafa. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the giver of death with no fear. That, oh, na'udhu billah, biggest, one of the greatest creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Muhammadur Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allah's Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam did go through death. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fears of nothing after giving death. He gives death to whoever's time comes for the death. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives him death. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has no fear. Sometime ummat goes through such difficult phrase. And there are some ulama, some scholars, some people that everybody looks at him. And at the same time he is gone. He dies. And we think that the time he was needed most, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him death. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fears of nothing. Fears of nobody. Fears of nothing when giving death. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us firmness into his tawheed. Ba'ithun bila mashaqqa. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when time will come, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will raise us again. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will revive us again. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will have ba'ath ba'd al-maut. After death, we will be resurrected again. We will be raised again. And that also will happen with no difficulty. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is being explained that when he wants to do something, he says kun. He is not even need of saying kun. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that powerful. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us correct understanding of Quran and Sunnah. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us firmness into the Aqidah of Tawheed. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidil Mursaleen. وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ومن تبعهم إلى يوم الدين يا أول الأولين يا آخر الآخرين يا راحم المساكين يا ذا القوة المتين يا ذا المن فلا يمن عليك يا ذا الطول يا ذا الجلال والإكرام لا إله إلا أنت زهر اللاجئين وجار المستجيرين ومأمن الخائفين يا مأمن الخائفين إن كنت كتبتنا عندك في الكتاب أشقياء فامحو عنا اسم الشقاء فامحو عنا اسم الشقاء فامحو عنا اسم الشقاء وإن كنت كتبتنا عندك في الكتاب مقطرا علينا أرزاقنا فامحو تقطير رزقنا وحرمان رزقنا واكتبنا وأثبتنا عندك سعداء ووفقنا الخير فإنك تقول في كتابك يمحو الله ما يشاء ويثبت وعنده الكتاب اللهم إنا نسألك فعل الخيرات وترك المنكرات وحب المساكين وأن تغفر لنا وترحمنا فإذا أردت بقوم فتنة فتوفنا غير مفتونين غير خزايا ولا ندامة ولا مفتونين اللهم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار اللهم ثبتنا على الإيمان وأمتنا على الإيمان واهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم من النبيين والصديقين والشهداء والصالحين اللهم اجعلنا من المؤمنين حقا اللهم ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب ربنا إننا سمعنا مناديا ينادي للإيمان أن آمنوا بربكم فآمنا ربنا فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا وتوفنا مع الأبرار ربنا وآتنا ما وعدتنا على رسلك ولا تخزنا يوم القيامة إنك لا تخلف الميعاد اللهم ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وصلى الله تعالى على خير خلقه سيدنا وحبيبنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين برحمته